Thank you. And next up is we're going to be looking at how to avoid common testing and certification pitfalls. The speaker's James Daniels, who's General Manager Connected Technologies at Element. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm sure he'll explain it to me. And responsible for operations in Skelmersdale, Malvern, Wimborne and Oxford. Very experienced in CE marking and conformity assessment advice and helping manufacturers reach their certification obligations. So you're going to explain connected technologies, are you? Thank you.
A little, perhaps. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, as just been said, I'm James Daniels. I'm the General Manager for one of the General Managers for Connected Technologies business in the UK. That means that I'm responsible for the operations in 4 UK labs. That's Malvern, Wimborne, Skelmersdale and Oxford. So I spend most of my time working with our team, trying to make our customers' journey to conformity as smooth as possible. Now, over my 20-ish years in the testing, inspection and certification sector, unfortunately I've seen many things go wrong in terms of non-conformities and testing failures. Product compliance is a little bit of a minefield and very complex. So I'm here today to try and give you the benefit of my experience and provide a little bit of advice regarding how to avoid the common pitfalls that we see in regard to EMC, safety, radio, testing and certification, which of course most manufacturers will be wanting to achieve. So, a little question, do you like to gamble? I suppose for me, it depends on what's at stake and what the odds are. Well, what if what's at stake is the successful launch of your product? Delays in getting to market, increased costs for testing and certification, limitations in the markets that you can place your product on. So that's quite a lot at stake. What about the odds? So if I was to tell you that with regards to EMC testing, approximately 50% of products fail first time when they come to us for EMC testing. And product safety testing, maybe you've got a 1 in 5 chance that your product will go through that safety testing process without requiring some type of re-evaluation or reassessment. So not great odds, but thankfully there's a lot that can be done to significantly improve those odds. So the first step is having a detailed plan, and that's a lot of synergy there with what's been said already today. We need to understand exactly what you want, what you need, and when you require it. And to get to the point of that plan is we need to understand our requirements. So different territories around the world have different requirements. Each market's legislation, schemes, regulators have different views with regards to what's legally required before you can place your product on the market. So mandatory third-party testing isn't always required for all types of for all types of products, but it typically is for medical devices. But in addition to those mandatory testing and certification requirements, you perhaps also need to think about any market expectations. And sometimes those market expectations can lead to there being some de facto requirements that you'll need to comply with. And then in addition to that, you may have some customer requirements or contractual requirements that you'll also need to comply with. So you need to think about all of those requirements together, because there may be some that conflict with each other. We need to identify those requirements before we get to the point of testing, because those requirements will dictate the design of a product. It will also dictate the nature of the components, or at least the conformity or approvals of the components that are employed in a product. It helps to decide at the start what those requirements are and what markets you want to place your product in, because if we can test for all of those markets at the same time, there are significant time savings to be made. So for example, to test for the US EMC requirements at the same time as the EU requirements may only take a couple of additional hours. But if you wanted to go back to a lab and have that EMC testing for the USA done at a later date, that means you've got to go back to the lab, you've got the setup, the test, the takedown of the product, plus you've got an additional report, plus amendments to your certification. So quite a significant amount of extra work and cost. So if there's one big tip that I can give you today, it's trying to design with compliance in mind. And again, this is something that was linked to earlier today. It's critical to understand what the requirements are of the standards that are going to apply to your products so that you can design your product with those requirements in mind. The last thing you want to do is get to the lab and have your product tested and find that because there were some design decisions that were made, your product won't comply with the standards. So I'd like to now start talking about some of the testing pitfalls. So first of all, we'll talk about EMC pitfalls. For those of you who are not sure what electromagnetic compatibility EMC is, when you pass a current along a wire or a PCB track, it can generate an electromagnetic field. And that field can couple onto the tracks and wires of other products. That can cause interference, that can cause other products to malfunction, so changes in performance, changes in accuracy. It will prevent it from operating, or even worst case cause damage to either other products in the intended environment or your own. Ensuring that the EMC requirements are met, ensuring that your product won't interfere or be interfered with, is really helped by, is tested by undertaking a series of EMC tests. Now, good EMC design practice will significantly help you meet those requirements or pass those tests, but success of your design can't be confirmed without testing. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about detailed EMC good design practice. I'm not going to. But if I can give you two significant tips, first of all, use compliant components. Now, that's not quite as easy as it sounds because it's really important to align the approvals and the testing that has been undertaken on those components with what applies to your product and its intended use. Also, use those compliant components as intended. Again, the components may have been tested in a particular way which may not align with how you want your product to be used. So make sure that those two things align. The other is the old favourite, CE plus CE doesn't necessarily equal CE. So it's surprising to me still that a lot of people come to us and they say, well, we don't need EMC testing because we've used all compliant components throughout the product. And I can assure you, and we see it time and time again, using compliant components doesn't ensure that your product will meet the EMC requirements. So some of you may be aware that the standard 60601-1-2 for EMC electromagnetic disturbances that relate to medical electrical equipment requires you to undertake an EMC test plan. There are lots more benefits to producing a test plan than just identifying the applicable tests, the test limits and test levels, particularly where your product is complex, perhaps if it's got different radio technologies, or it's intended to be used in lots of different environments, or it's got multiple modes of operation. So a test plan identifies exactly what modes need to be tested for each of the individual tests. We can't just take the test levels and limits straight out of the standard. What we need to do is think about what's in the risk management file with regards to EMC, because that risk management file might tell us that actually there's some additional testing that needs to be performed. So we have to read that the risk management file in conjunction with producing that test plan. The second benefit is that a test plan can actually help to justify the consolidation of some of those requirements. So on the slide here it shows the different voltages and frequency combinations for various different places around the world. On the right hand side you can see that actually with some careful consideration and justification it might be possible to condense and reduce the number of different combinations down to fewer, which of course will save time throughout your testing. Effectively, each one of those combinations is a multiplier of the entire series of EMC testing. It's also the case that different global bodies may have different views on what's required. So, for example, the FDA's position is that it's not only magnetically sensitive products or components in a product that may be sensitive to power frequency magnetic fields. There's a simple test to perform, and the FDA would typically expect to see some evidence that that has been considered, even though the standard that is used by the majority of the rest of the world suggests that that's not required. Similarly, the FDA typically required to see evidence that you've considered the immunity of your products to RFID readers. And again, there's a standard for that, there's a test we can perform, but that's not required by many other places around the world. A test plan considers many different aspects of how a product should be tested, different configurations, different modes, etc. For medical electrical devices, this is even more important because we need to consider the essential performance and basic safety of a medical device. And that's something that needs to be agreed before we can undertake the testing, because that dictates exactly how your product needs to be exercised during the testing and also how we're going to monitor it during the testing. We also need to think about the pass-fail criteria for the non-essential functions of the product, and we also need to consider how that is going to be interpreted by an EMC engineer who may not have the specialist medical knowledge that is needed to be able to interpret the data that comes from your product to the extent that it can determine whether it's met the requirements. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about safety testing pitfalls. Product safety testing significantly depends upon the documentation. Having all the documentation at the outset, significantly reduces test times, safety testing times. I can't stress enough, but lack of documentation is perhaps the biggest cause of delays in safety testing. The test lab will require certain documentation to enable them to undertake that safety testing, and it's not always possible to identify exactly which documentation is required until the testing commences. But if you were to provide all of the information on that list, then you've got a really good chance of providing all the documentation that is necessary. There's an important side note here, which is that it's really critical to make sure that the correct documentation is provided. IEC certification for safety critical components is essential, and quite frankly, or quite simply rather, if we don't have the appropriate approval documentation for the safety critical components, we simply won't be able to certify your product. So, the most common issue, as I say, is regarding documentation, and that might be missing documentation or incorrect documentation. And that can be application forms that have information that doesn't match with the product or the instruction manual. It might be diagrams or drawings that are missing, that need to be provided to enable us to undertake certain assessments or confirm that certain requirements have been met. And that can be difficult to obtain for yourselves if it's for components that have been bought off the shelf but have no approvals, that require approvals such as motherboards. Instructions are a key part of the safety assessment, and it's really critical that we make sure that the instruction manual and the company documentation contains all of the relevant information. And that's typically within the standards. Incorrect markings, warnings and symbols, again, another easy fix. The requirements are typically in the standard, and it's important to use the international markings as referred to in the standard. In addition, there's guidance in the standards with regards to ensuring that the markings are indelible, legible, and suitably durable. And then lastly, the critical components that you use need to be, as I say, appropriately approved, and they need to align with your product's intended use. So you can't use a power supply that is intended for indoor use if your product is intended to be used outdoors without some further testing and assessment, which may not be possible. Similarly, if your product is intended to be used in environments that is greater than 40 degrees, then you'll need to make sure that the approvals for the components you use also align with that. Sample availability is another area where significant delays can be avoided. If you can provide final representative samples, it makes it a lot easier for us to undertake that testing. We can undertake some testing on a prototype, as we'll discuss in a moment, but ultimately having the product fully functional is certainly going to be a lot easier for everybody. We can also try to avoid any risks associated with delays by providing some spare parts. So if you've got spare safety critical components such as fuses or transformers, that means that if there is a problem, a non-conformity, or the product's not working as it should, then we won't have to wait for other samples to be sent. The other advantage of providing multiple samples, of course, is that we can undertake the EMC, radio and safety testing all simultaneously rather than doing that in sequence. So I'd like to now move on to typical radio pitfalls. So if you're using an off-the-shelf radio module, this can significantly reduce the radio testing required, but some assessment is quite likely still required. But you need to make sure that the radio module has the appropriate approvals. Again, don't just trust that it has a CE mark. We need to you need to check that it has the appropriate approvals, and you need to be able to provide the evidence in your technical file to that effect. The radio module that you use may be FCC approved, but actually there's still some restrictions that can typically exist in regard to that and on the FCC grant approval. So you'll need to check what those restrictions are and ensure that you don't breach those restrictions, such as it may say that you can't co-locate a module or use the module in a stationary or a mobile product, etc. If you're using two radio modules in a single product, then that's termed co-location, which can cause intermodulation products. Now that's something that would have to be tested for. However, if those radio modules don't operate at the same time, then that's not something that we're going to need to test. So that's something that may save some time for you. If your product has a radio device in it, or more than one, then that will likely require some additional EMC testing. We'll need to undertake the EMC testing when each of the radio modules are operational. Now, if you've got multiple radio technologies, unless they operate at the same time, then that can be, again, a multiplier for the EMC testing required. So that can significantly extend the amount of testing. Unless, of course, you can put your product in a special mode that enables us to have those radio devices operating at the same time just for the EMC testing. And most importantly, it's really critical that we ensure that the radio modules are configured for the radio testing. This is probably the biggest cause of delays when we come to radio testing, is that we can't undertake the radio testing that we need to because the radio module hasn't been configured correctly. So please do work with your chosen testing partner well ahead of schedule, well before testing, to make sure that the radio modules are configurable or configured for the radio testing to go ahead. Another really effective way of minimising the chance of failure is by pre-compliance testing. So with regards to EMC, we term this pre-compliance testing. We can either undertake a sort of full test on a prototype, or we can undertake a limited range of tests. So it might be quick scans or a reduced amount of testing on a finished product. And that's a really good way of giving an early indication of likely non-conformities. We can also do this with safety. So we can undertake something called a design review. And that's, again, an early look at a prototype product, or even a design concept, and give some indications as to whether the product is likely to meet the requirements. And that can look at the enclosure of the product. We can look at the materials. Enclosure is really quite useful to look at that early days, because it means that we can check that that's likely to be compliant before you're committed to your tooling. We can also check the labelling information and the information in your manual. All really effective ways of reducing those possible delays. And then lastly, I'd like to just talk about certification pitfalls. So first of all, it's really helpful just to have a general awareness of the certification and regulation landscape. As we know, as we've talked about today, obviously things do change and things are often in flux, certainly as is the case in the UK and EU at the moment. So it's difficult to keep that knowledge up to date, but it certainly is very beneficial. If testing was completed some time ago, it is possible that the testing that was undertaken may not meet the current standards. And that's unlikely. There's a long transition period typically with new standards, and standards don't change all that often. However, if you have undertaken the testing over a long period of time, it's certainly quite important to make sure that the testing that was undertaken still applies. Certification and regulatory approval can take a little bit longer than you think. So after all of that testing has been completed, to obtain CB certification might take only 3 weeks if all goes well, and that's typical. But for FDA approval, if things don't go well, it can take significantly longer. So do make sure that you're allowing sufficient time for things to overrun. Think about the critical path. It's typical that we undertake EMC testing before safety testing. It doesn't have to be done that way, but that's usually the best way to approach that. We typically have to undertake the software and usability assessments before we can complete the safety report. So again, make sure that documentation, the evidence that those activities have been undertaken are available before we undertake that safety testing. But the critical path is actually the risk management. So we will require your risk management file before we undertake the EMC testing and before we undertake the safety testing. So that activity, that document, the risk management file is absolutely critical, and that is your critical path. Don't overlook software and usability. If your product has software, it's quite typical that an assessment of the software will be required. And factor in additional time. The software and usability assessment is typically a 3-stage process. You'll submit that evidence of what you've done. We'll review it and provide some feedback. You'll make some changes and it'll provide it back to us. We'll review it again, provide some further guidance, further input, and then again there'll be likely some feedback provided before you make some final tweaks, and we can confirm everything's been met on the third pass. So do allow some additional time for that. The application that you make, again, must match the product, and we see this quite a lot, that the information in the application form doesn't align with the information in the manual or on the label of the product. It's an easy fix, but it just adds a little bit of time into the process. Component obsolescence. If you have got additional components to allow for component obsolescence, please do make sure that you're providing us with a relevant conformity certification approvals documentation for those components. But above all, make sure that you've planned the process thoroughly, and you've allowed sufficient time for overrun and for that activity to take. So I'd just like to make the point of the importance of engaging with your chosen testing and certification partner early. So you'll first start developing your product, you spend money on development and testing, you'll obtain your certification, and then you'll be able to launch your product. That's when the money starts rolling in. At some point in the future, the returns will pass over the investment and you'll start making some profit. But at some point in the future, it will reach its end of life, which is something that you may not have any control over. So if your time to market is delayed, then ultimately your time in that profitable zone is going to be limited. Also, if there are any design failures that have occurred, then that's going to obviously increase your initial investment. So the recommendation, of course, is to get your product to market as quickly as possible. So good planning and engaging early with your chosen testing and certification partner. Even if there's a steeper rate of spend in the early days, you don't waste 3 or 4 days on trying to avoid a half an hour, half a day test. It's not always a good strategy. So hopefully I've made it clear that the best approach to ensuring that your testing and certification it goes well is by being well prepared. Engage with your partner early, ensure that the process is clearly mapped out and understood, make sure that your test plan is completed in good time, and ensure that appropriate number of samples is provided. Ensure that all of the components you use have the necessary certification and approvals, and ensure that documentation is completed and provided before testing starts. Have a strategy, plan early, engage with your chosen partner. I urge you to consider design or prototype EMC testing or safety testing. And if you need any help, of course, Element can support you. We can produce a compliance strategy document, and that could detail the legislative requirements, identify applicable standards, create your EMC test plan, and confirm the certification requirements for global market access. In my opinion, for what it's worth, having a clear strategy and a detailed plan is the best way to avoid the avoidable pitfalls of testing and certification. Thank you.
Thank you, James. That was excellent, and I particularly like the last slide because we had a discussion about the engagement of senior management in the regulatory process, and that graph on impact on your bottom line is the one thing that senior management, chief executives are going to want to know about, and if they're blindsided to that, it causes all sorts of problems. So I think the lesson's very clear to me: planning, planning, planning. Then your execution is likely to be timely.
Absolutely.
Anyway, we've got some questions. How do you interpret the definition of a critical component? That's a good one.
It is a really good question, and actually it's not an easy one to answer because it's somewhat